All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending this evening. It's my pleasure to have the chance to do this presentation. I'm Gareth Dyke. As our host already mentioned, I'm working with Research Square, but a lot of the content that you're going to see this evening in our presentation comes from EdAnts, comes from the EdAnts Learning Lab. So I point to you immediately those two companies, and what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about understanding and navigating research and publishing ethics. And as Naran already mentioned, this is something that many authors, unfortunately, many researchers are simply unaware of. So what we hope to do with our presentation this evening is to make you aware of some of the very common issues that researchers face in the publishing process in terms of ethics and ethical considerations. And if I could just ask you, if you are listening to this, please do mute your microphones so that I'll be able to give an uninterrupted and hopefully enjoyable, we'll see how you feel at the end, presentation. If you have questions, then we will have time for questions at the end. Of course, please do write your questions there into the chat box. You'll find that chat box down there on the right hand side of your control panel. You might very well be asking, who is this English guy shouting at me this evening? Well, my name's Gareth Dyke. I work for Research Square. I've just been working also with EdAnts, the EdAnts Learning Lab. I worked as an academic for more than 20 years in the UK, in the United States, in Ireland, and now in Hungary. I've published almost more than 300 academic papers. And I also work as a journal editor. I work as a journal editor with Taylor and Francis with the journal Historical Biology. So I'm hoping that in this presentation, we'll be able to help you, guide you, share with you some insights on the kinds of ethical issues that researchers tend to face in the publishing process. Now, we're all aware of this. We write papers, we submit them to journals, we get them back after peer review, we then revise and resubmit. Hopefully those papers get accepted and then they pass into production. But the point of this training, the point of this webinar today is to talk about some of the pitfalls, some of the issues, some of the ethical considerations around doing research and getting research submitted and published in international journals that often we find researchers are unaware of, unfortunately. So our aim with this training is to help you to be aware of these issues so that you can avoid them, not fall foul of them in your own research and publishing journey. So this is what I like to call the research and publishing hamster wheel. I don't know if you've ever had a pet hamster, goes around and around and around on a wheel. You come up with an idea, you try to get funding, you collect data, you then select a journal to get that research work published in, you then write the paper, you then go for the submission, and then you go into the peer review and publication process. And then you go round and around, and again, you go with more of your ideas. But our point, as I mentioned, is to talk about some of the issues that researchers often encounter in the research and publishing cycle. So have a think about the research that you're currently doing, that you're thinking about doing at your university, at your hospital, at your research institute. We'll talk about many of these issues this evening in a little bit more detail: safety, submissions, plagiarism, cheating, authorship, and conflicts of interest. Now, as Naran mentioned at the beginning, nobody ever intends to fall foul of ethical considerations, but it often happens, as I've mentioned, because people are unaware often of what's expected of them at international journals. So it's important to know about some of these things. From my publishing background, from my academic background, from my research background, I hope to be able to enlighten you on some of the issues, some of the things that we need to be aware of as researchers when we write and publish our articles for international journals. So let's get started. Let's begin. This presentation is divided into 4 sections. And the first one, of course, begins before you begin to write. Before you start to put your article together for publication, some common ethical issues, some common things to think about before you begin the writing process. And I should have said already, of course, you'll get access to a recording of this presentation at the end. You can ask any questions that you may wish to ask in the chat box. We'll hope to answer them at the end of our presentation this evening. Thank you once again for joining us. What to think about, what ethical issues to consider when beginning to write your paper. Well, you may be aware of these reporting guidelines. If you're not, it's well worth being aware of them. If you're going to be writing a certain kind of article, doing a certain kind of study, there are, of course, a number of checklists already available that can help you with those reporting procedures. So if you're doing a systematic review, there's a checklist for that. If you're doing a randomized controlled trial, there's a checklist for that. If you're doing observational studies, there's a checklist for that. Qualitative case reports and animal studies, have a look at the equatornetwork.org. If you are thinking of beginning a research study and you're unsure what ethical considerations there are to take into account, what kinds of things do you need to report in your study? There are guidelines out there, so let's have a look at them before we begin. Top tip number 1, it's important, of course, when beginning a study to think, is my work original? What is original research? Well, it's research that's not been published before. No prior translations, we'll come back to that later. No redundancy, no salami slicing, we'll come back to that also later. And no media publicity of the work beyond conference materials. This is what makes your research, when you put it onto a preprint platform like Research Square, when you put it out into the published literature, this is what makes it original in its content. So have a look at some of these checklists that we're going to provide at the beginning of this presentation and start to think about your research and whether you can publish it if it's original. And if you're doing it, of course, it will be, but you do need to make sure that you have the right kinds of permissions in place if you are reusing figures or data or tables or images from other people's studies. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in the context of plagiarism, because it's very important to be aware of that as well. But if you're looking at preprints, blogs, reports, conference proceedings, translations, summaries, or regional publications, do you have the copyright clearance to republish that information? A great resource for everybody we like to point out at the beginning of this kind of presentation is, of course, the fantastic thinkchecksubmit.org resource, where you can go and, in addition to the Equator Network, which I've already shown you, before you begin that research and writing process, are you conforming to the ethical guidelines of your particular study type? And of course, I know that many people from different research areas will be listening to this presentation, either here on the Zoom platform or on the Facebook page, but have a look at these resources, equatornetwork.org, thinkchecksubmit.org, before you begin the process of putting your paper together. Academic honesty is, of course, very important, and we'll cover all of these topics in a little bit more detail in a little while in this presentation this evening. Don't plagiarize. Don't use ghostwriters, don't make up, alter or omit any data, don't delete or alter records, keeping poor records, and of course, don't cheat or help others to cheat in your academic work. So these are the fundamentals of academic honesty. So many questions that we get from colleagues beginning a research project, thinking about writing it up for publication. One of the most common questions, of course, is, should I share my slides after giving a conference talk? It's important to think about this, of course. What was in your slides? If your slides contain published research, then of course it's a good thing to share them far and wide. If it's published research, Make sure, however, like you can see on many of my slides, there is an attribution, there is a source, the relevant citations, the DOIs to your article, because of course, when you share your slides from a conference, if it's published work, then colleagues will have to cite you. They will be given that DOI, they will be able to use your work in the future. It's also, I think, very important to have a think about who's in the audience for the presentations that you might be giving. Who's asking you for unpublished data? Is it a colleague you know, or is it somebody that you've worked with in the past, or is it somebody from a competing research team? Just to get us going, one of the most common questions that we always get asked in our workshops about unpublished research. And I also want to highlight key issues around authorship. What do we mean when we talk about authorship on academic papers? Well, ghost authors and gift authors are both unethical. They're both things that shouldn't happen in academic publishing. What are they? A ghost author is where somebody who did lots of work writing a paper is not included as an author. Maybe you've paid somebody to write the paper for you, or somebody's written the work but has not been included as an author. So that's not ethical, and that's something that we'll come back to in a minute. But as a researcher thinking about who should be an author on your study, it's important to know before you begin the writing process who will be on that authorship list. Secondly, gift authorships. This is where somebody who hasn't contributed to an article is nevertheless included as an author. This happens all the time. A director of a research group, a PI, for example. It's very common, especially for early career researchers. But is it ethical? I'm sure that we'll have some discussions about this at the end. There are tips for authorship. I'll share with you some links to this as well. The ICMJE, International Commission of Medical Journal Editors, very important resource, provides a number of guidelines for authorship when you get it writing your papers. Joint first authorships also are very common, becoming increasingly common in academic publishing. What are they? This slide explains information about that. Should you sign up to be a joint first author? That's where authors indicate on the top of an academic paper that they both contributed equally to the study. I personally think they're not such a good idea, because always papers get cited with one author and then et al, or one author first if it's just two authors. But nevertheless, it's important to be aware of this when you think about starting your research. And I would recommend strongly that when you start to write up your research, you agree who the authors are going to be on the study, and also the order of those authors, because that certainly does solve any problems that you may have later on down the line. So thinking about starting a research project, check those reporting guidelines, check thinkchecksubmit.org, and think about who the authors are going to be on the study. Get that lined up, get that information together. Know the authorship order before you begin the writing process. Be careful about agreeing to a joint first authorship. Are they meaningful, or are they just cosmetic? Of course, we'll share with you this slide deck after the presentation so you can have a look at the slides in more detail. But authorship, who's an author? What's the order of authorships? ICMJE.org, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, provides guidelines on this. The Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE, as well. So check out those resources if you're interested in learning more. If you're interested in learning more information about this. Our recommendation, though, is to be careful about agreeing to being a joint first author if you can. So paper mills as well, very difficult area, very important area for us to touch on in this presentation. There are numerous studies recently that have talked about this, that have discussed. A recent Committee on Publication Ethics forum discussion focused on the significant problem of paper mills. This is where made-up papers are submitted to journals for a fee on behalf of researchers with the purpose of providing an easy publication or to offer authorship for sale. And actually these kinds of paper mills, people pay to get their papers published, are becoming more and more common, as you can see here. Ethically speaking, of course, researchers should write up and publish their own research, not pay for fake publications or undeserved authorships. This is a huge issue in terms of the integrity of academic work. And again, plagiarism, something that we'll talk about in a minute, is often not detected immediately because these milled papers are translated, often versions of others. I point you to the Singapore Statement on Research Integrity. We are going to be acting with honesty in all aspects of our research, accountability in the conduct of our research, professional courtesy and fairness in working with others, and we're going to provide good stewardship of research on behalf of others. So I think it's important to keep these things in mind as we develop our research projects. So no misconduct or fraud. This slide summarizes what we mean by those terms. And again, we'll share this presentation with you at the end this evening so you can have a look at all of this in more detail. We respect human rights in our analyses, especially medical researchers. If you're doing a human-based study, then make sure you do have approval from your ethics committee. If you're doing information, if you're doing qualitative work involving information from individuals, then protecting their personal information is often very important, a mandatory requirement of these kinds of studies as well. So you'll need ethical approval before you begin your work. And that's often something that researchers are again unaware of. Ethical approval from your own institution, as well as from your government or from your Ministry of Health. So that's the first bit. Before you begin to write, what about during the writing process? Common ethical issues to consider during the writing process. And again, avoiding errors and misconduct. Often it's something that people are simply unaware of, not checking the work of others, ignoring by mistake the work of others, overlooking the use of flawed data, not declaring those conflicts of interest, or publishing in journals that aren't really peer reviewed. So again, I refer you to the great resource thinkchecksubmit.org. Don't ignore, misquote the work of others, cite your sources, obtain copyright permission if needed, reference your work carefully. Hello, does somebody want to jump in and say something? Okay, please. We have the chat box open. If you'd like to ask questions, that would be fantastic if you type your questions into the chat box. Otherwise, colleagues, if you could keep your microphones muted until the end when we have time for questions, that would be fantastic. Avoiding errors and misconduct. Don't ignore, misquote the previous work of others. Cite your sources. Acknowledge people who helped. Acknowledge funders and donors of material, and for presentations and publications that you may use in your research, it's important to check the authorship carefully. So this is a great backbone for an academic paper. When you think about your introduction, why did you do the study? When you think about your methods, what did you do? When you think about your results, what did you find? And when you think about your discussion, how did you contribute to the field? This is a great backbone, not just for the shape of an academic paper, but also, by the way, a template for writing an effective abstract. An effective abstract in an academic paper is really just answers to these four questions. So in the writing process, really the most common ethical issue that we encounter is the issue of plagiarism. What does that mean? Well, plagiarism means taking somebody else's ideas, processes. Plagiarism means taking the work. Plagiarism means taking someone else's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving proper credit. And this, of course, is academically dishonest because we're expected to do our own work. So often people, though, are unaware of how they can avoid plagiarism, or indeed what plagiarism is. Did you know, for example, that you can steal from yourself? Self-plagiarism in academic writing is a serious issue. It's the attempt to take your own previously published text, papers, or research results and make them appear new. So you cannot use a data set from a previous study without making the reader aware. You cannot submit a manuscript for publication that contains data, conclusions, or passages that have already been published elsewhere without citing that previous work, and you can't publish multiple similar papers about the same study in different journals. That's called salami slicing. We'll come back to that in a moment. So we sat down and we came up with some of the most common forms of academic plagiarism. Mosaic plagiarism, that's where you include data from various sources, mix them together and make the writing seem original. People do it all the time. Paraphrasing plagiarism. Even if you're paraphrasing some work from another study, some words from another study, you've still got to cite the original source. The idea remains the same. And perhaps the least understood, I should say, is the issue of self-plagiarism. That's failing to cite your own previous work, even though you're simply revising an old idea or a previously published observation. I know if you publish something in a journal and then you want to refer to that later, maybe a figure or a table or a map, in one of your own previous publications, you don't own that anymore. You've got to cite your own previous work. So one of the most common questions we get, actually, can I reuse images from my own previously published papers? You can, but you must self-cite. Otherwise, this is self-plagiarism. Check who owns the copyright. Is it you or the journal? Because different kinds of journals, open access or traditional journals, have different rules, standards on copyright. Let's have a look at some examples. In my own previously published work, in this example, I published a paper in 2020 in the Biological Journal of the Linnaean Society, and the publisher owns the copyright. So I need to ask permission from the publisher, the Linnaean Society of London, if I want to reuse a figure from my own paper in a subsequent paper. And of course, I've got to cite that as well. So not just citing the source, but asking permission from the publisher to reuse one of my own figures. Of course, they're going to give you permission, but you have to do it because that's the kind of journal that the Linnaean Society journals are. They're traditional journals. They're not published open access. You've got to have a subscription to get access to that content. So they own the copyright. You sign that over to the journal when you make the submission. Here's another example from an open access publication that we put together in 2019. It's in Scientific Reports, open access paid for journal. There's an article processing charge to get the work published in this forum. I own the copyright, so I don't need to ask permission to reuse the figures. I've got that CC BY license that many open access journals, most open access journals provide. But even though I own the copyright, one of the big advantages of open access publishing, I still do need, of course, to cite the original. Otherwise, that would be self-plagiarism. Here's a third example from my own work. I own the copyright. I've got that CC license, plus journals are open access. But again, I've got to cite the original article if I want to reuse the figure that I created, I made it, I published it in this PLOS One paper. If I want to reuse it again, I've got to cite my own work. So most plagiarism in academic publishing is accidental. Authors don't realize that they're doing it. And we all do this. If you read something in a second or third language, you think, wow, that sounds great. English is not your first language. You might read something in English, think that sounds fantastic, and then use it in your own work in the future. However, this is a problem. This is plagiarism. You'll get caught by international journals who run plagiarism checks on papers that get submitted. So for that reason, it's important to consider getting your work checked before submission by a plagiarism checking service. We provide that, of course, if you want to get in touch with me at the end of this presentation. Journals are looking for less than 10% similarity with previously published work in order to send your paper out for peer review. This is what a plagiarism check looks like. This paper has failed the plagiarism check. 32% similarity with previously published work. All international journals do this. They check papers when they get submitted. They then make a decision. If it's over 10% similar to other papers without citation, you'll get rejected. That's an ethical problem for you, and you could end up getting blacklisted by a whole publisher. So do consider thinking about the issue of plagiarism. Cite your sources, cite your own work if you're reusing it from your own previously published papers, and potentially get in touch with us. We can provide you with access to a plagiarism checking service. Into section 3, submission. Some common ethical issues to consider at the submission stage. We've talked about this already. You're not supposed to submit the same work or similar work to lots of different journals at the same time. That's called salami slicing. It's unethical. Publishing a paper that substantially overlaps with your already published work is called salami slicing. It's a waste of time for editors and peer reviewers. It might artificially inflate your publication rate, but you'll get caught because the field is small. Peer reviewers talk to each other. There will be a point at which people start to notice that your publications are too similar to the work that you've already published. So try to avoid reporting your results one at a time. This is salami slicing. Think, is this work standalone? Is it really a distinct piece of research? Is it so similar in scope to my recent work that it doesn't add anything to the field? Check your target journal for similar papers to see what other authors are doing. Journals want interesting, hypothesis-based studies. Again, if you're trying to figure out what journal to use for your next paper, then you can't go wrong at thinkchecksubmit.org. Is the journal trusted and appropriate? Do you know the journal? Is it listed by COPE? Is it listed in the directory of open access journals if it's an open access journal? And then submit if you're sure. Don't rush it. Put some time and effort into this. Researchers put lots of effort and energy into their research. Of course you do. But we find that often authors, researchers, don't put the same time and energy and effort into selecting a journal as they should do, as certainly as they do doing their research. So this is a step that's well worth taking. Is the publisher reputable? Who's on the editorial board? Do you know any of the colleagues on the editorial board? Can you write to them and talk to them? Sorry about that. I muted myself in order to have a coughing fit, and then I couldn't put my volume back on again. So if you're thinking about which journal to submit your next paper to, then have a look at the website. Have a look at the editorial board. Is the journal indexed? What kinds of articles have been published in that journal previously? And what kinds of fees are they asking for? A reputable open access journal should never be asking for any payment, any fees before your paper gets accepted. So again, think about this. Thinkchecksubmit.org is a great resource for you to have a look at the journals that you might wish to take your next article to. And if open access is important to you, if the fact that lots of colleagues, all colleagues around the world are able to download and access your articles without charge, if open access is the most important thing for you, and it certainly is for many colleagues, it is for me, then have a look at the directory of open access journals. Here on the doaj.org, you can go in, you can search by keywords, you can search across your subject area, you can look at the impact factor, you can look at the cost for publication in reputable open access journals. So we strongly recommend this resource to everybody as Well, Jeffrey Beal, you may have heard of this guy, in the 1990s was a librarian at the University of Colorado. He created what's called Beal's list of predatory publishers. It is widely considered to be out of date these days, so have a look at that as well. But this list is frozen since the mid-2000s. It's something that you may want to have a think about. But nevertheless, is your journal reputable? Is it a good place for your next research? Finally, then, in the time that we have left, let's have a quick look at post-submission, some common ethical issues to consider after you submit your paper and after it's gone into the journal system. We've talked about things to do before you begin the writing process, ethical issues to consider at the beginning of the process. You're thinking of putting a research project together. You're thinking of writing a research project, checklists, authorship, for example. We've talked about what happens when you write. We've talked about plagiarism. When you make the submission, we've talked about journal selection as well. But after submission to a journal, what happens next? And I always start this section of the presentation by thinking about what happened to me at our journal relatively recently. So picture the scene. A paper was submitted and peer-reviewed with 5 co-authors. The paper was accepted with 5 co-authors. But then one of the authors decided that he did not agree anymore with the contents of the paper and wanted to leave the authorship. He wanted to step away from the paper. Now, journals hate these kinds of situations. It's one reason why earlier we encouraged you to line up your authorship before you begin the writing process, because it's very difficult to change the authorship of your paper after it's been submitted to a journal. So all initial authors on a submission, of course, have to approve any changes. So if somebody wants to come off a paper after it's been accepted for publication, there's lots of paperwork involved. You have to get signed permissions from all of the other authors that this is going to be okay. So it's a problem. It can be potentially an ethical consideration after acceptance at an international journal. Any changes to authorship are difficult to make. Another common post-submission inquiry that we often get is this one. I published a paper in one language, Arabic, Russian, Chinese, I don't know. Can I publish it again? Can I translate it and republish it in English? Is this a good idea? You can do it, but be very, very careful, because although translated text can be republished, you need to carefully cite your original article, especially any figures or tables that were used in that original article. In my own experience of this, like here's a story from my own publishing career. My old friend Yevgeny Kurochkin, Russian colleague who passed away a number of years ago, published a paper in Russian. He then invited me to collaborate with him on the same material, and we wrote a paper in English. So the English translation of the original Russian paper, still with me, the English translation of the original Russian paper then appeared in what's called a mirror journal, where one language is published and then a translation is published in the same journal. And the two papers didn't cite each other. Huge problem, big deal. Of course, our English language paper on the same material, we did more than the original Russian paper, but we should, of course, have cited the original article. So my point with this is, if you are translating, if you are going to publish something again that's already been published in another language, maybe again in English, be very careful to cite the original source, or you may face ethical issues in the future. So indeed, there are a number of key issues to keep in mind that we've touched on over the course of our presentation this evening. Almost nobody intends to act unethically. Of course they don't. Very, very low proportions of academic authors deliberately act unethically. But nevertheless, there are lots of issues at journals, lots of issues in the publishing process before, during, and after the writing process that can become problems for colleagues if they're unaware of some of the pitfalls, of some of the issues. Most of the ethical issues that occur during the publishing process occur because researchers are simply unaware of those things, and in particular, above all, the issues of plagiarism. And I can see that we already have a question or two coming in the chat box about plagiarism. Almost nobody intends to act unethically. Most ethical issues that occur during the publishing process occur because researchers are simply unaware of those issues. And I think maybe at this point, like, we could start to throw it open. If anyone has any questions, any comments, any things that they'd like to ask, that would be absolutely fantastic. I can see that we have some questions coming in already. I've finished my kind of shouting section of the presentation this evening, but I see 2 questions already, which is absolutely fantastic. And please don't be shy, like, we have some time left now. It's a great opportunity for me to get to know you a little bit more. If you're able to ask questions, put your questions into the chat box. So many journals are counting terminology and Latin names among this 10% plagiarism, which is a fake plagiarism. Absolutely. References too often inadvertently get caught in that net. What's the right way to overcome it? Do you think the submission of a plagiarism report with the original submission will be beneficial? Absolutely. I do. Absolutely. What you should do is take out these sections of your paper, take off the reference list, and send it to us or send it to another colleague or another company. Run it through one of the plagiarism checking pieces of software and submit, as you've noted. Absolutely submit that plagiarism report with your submission to the journal. That's a great question. I've seen that a number of times. Yes, absolutely. Put the plagiarism report into your submission. Do we have to include the reference section in the plagiarism checker? No, that shouldn't be included because, of course, it will artificially inflate the percentage in the plagiarism check, of course, because the references are directly sourced from other references. So they'll go up artificially. That's why in our response to this previous question, it's important potentially to run your paper through a plagiarism checker before you make the submission. You can then include that report with your submission to a journal. What's happening behind the scenes, unfortunately, at international journals is editors are just clicking buttons on electronic interfaces, on web interfaces, and often they're making mistakes. So your paper might get a more than 10% check percentage artificially, and that's something, of course, that you want to avoid. So try to preempt as much of that as possible at the beginning of the process. How can I know that my research idea hasn't been done before so I can avoid duplication of research? Well, that's a great question, and thank you for it, Kulod. You have to have a way to check the literature. You have to have a way to survey the literature effectively in your field. I'm going to make a recommendation in the chat box here. If you haven't seen Researcher app, if you search online for an app that you can download onto your phone called Researcher app, I suggest that you do that because you can sign up for free on that app. You can put in some keywords related to your own research, and that will give you a daily information feed onto your phone about recently published articles in your own research field. Indeed, so to determine what else has been published in your field and to stay on top of the literature, very important to attempt to do that, of course. by having access to recent literature, by using search engines, by signing up for journal tables of contents, for example, by getting onto listservs in your field, or by checking preprint servers, for example, the Research Square preprint server. You can come onto our site, you can search for recently published or recently uploaded, I should say, preprints in your own research area. That's another great way to stay on top of research in your area. Researcher app, though, is another great, free and easy way, which is fantastic. So how can I know that my research hasn't been done before so I can avoid duplication of research? Check the literature, be on top of the literature, and try to stay up to date with what's being published in your field. So the best programs for plagiarism checking: Crossref, Authenticate, PlagScan. Like, I can give you a list of these at the end of the presentation. There are several ones that you can use for free. For example, Grammarly has a free plagiarism checking software. As I'll show you in a minute, some of our services at our company, we can give you access to plagiarism checking and software packages as well. So Nivan says, how can I protect my idea from anyone in department seminars, supervisors who may hear and publish the same idea before me, or ignoring me to participate and become in the authorship? Great question. How can you protect your research from other people taking the idea and publishing it for themselves? Well, the first thing to think about is, at what stage of your research are you when you make a presentation in a department or at a seminar or at a conference? Because, of course, as we talked about earlier on in our seminar this evening, if your research is not published or on a preprint server, then of course you probably don't want to be sharing it with other people. One of the great things about the Research Square preprint server, if you jump on over to researchsquare.com, you can have a look at our preprint server. I'll put the link here in the chat box. A preprint server is a place where you can upload your research in draft, get it assigned with a document object identifier number, get it assigned with a DOI number, and then of course it's not peer reviewed, it's not published yet, but it's out there, it's stamped with your name, with your intellectual property. So I would actually recommend, if you're thinking of giving a presentation at a conference or even at a seminar and you have that concern, why not upload a draft of your work to our preprint server? And then, of course, somebody else won't be able to take the idea because the idea will be online, protected on that preprint server. So I hope that helps. And of course, you can feel free to get in touch with me at the end if you have any further questions about that, because Nivan, that's a great question. Can you give us a brief idea about a back translation process for an already validated questionnaire? For example, to translate the questionnaire from English to Arabic and then English again. Yeah, this is a very commonly used technique to get around plagiarism checkers, or a way to recycle, turn the text around as a kind of paraphrasing approach. I would say it's a great way to paraphrase, but you should still cite the original, I would say, because that's just ethical, that's just fair, that's just what you should be doing. But of course, you know, you can certainly back translate, and everybody does this to change the text significantly in order that you can start the rewriting process and have something that's quite significantly different from the original. I'll show you in a minute our translation service at Research Square. Maybe you'll be interested in signing up for a free account with us, because of course we can help you with that as well. We have another question. Should we submit the tables or the scheme into the plagiarism report? Does a publication of a survey-based cross-sectional study utilizing only descriptive statistics make editors underestimate the paper or make it liable for rejection? It's a very good question. Of course, you have to convince editors, you have to demonstrate to editors, even in a cross-sectional study, even in a very descriptive, statistical-based study, you've got to demonstrate to editors when you make the submission to your target journal that the work is interesting and worthy of peer review. And so for that reason, we didn't talk about this evening, but for that reason, writing an effective cover letter when you make your submission to an international journal is also absolutely critical. We'll cover this in more detail in some of our later presentations in this series, but in fact, when you make a submission, having an effective, well-written, well-targeted, convincing cover letter that goes with the submission to the editor is very important, because in that cover letter, you can talk about why the study is so important and why it should be sent out for peer review. So if I've got a survey-based cross-sectional study that utilizes only descriptive statistics, I've got to write and send to the journal an effective, well-written and convincing cover letter so that the editor will want to take that paper on and send it out for peer review. Don't forget that in leading international journals, large proportions of submissions get rejected before they get sent out for peer review. So that's important. And thank you so much for that question. I think we're approaching the end of our questions. I mean, I don't know if you want to jump in and say something. Anyone else? I have another question. What is best to do if I'm going to conduct a survey study and there is one self-prepared questionnaire published previously that will help me? Well, if there's published questionnaires, if there's previous information that's been published before, then I would use that information, build on that information, cite that information, because it's always very good to get citations into your own work, because that shows, of course, that the area is interesting. If somebody else has done some work on that area in the past, then having a previously published questionnaire is actually a good thing. I think it's a really strong thing. It's a valuable thing to have that, to cite that, to build on that in your own work. So you'll also have to add potentially other questions of your own to the questionnaire. We can help you with that. If you need assistance with developing those questions, do get in touch with me at the end of this presentation. We do lots of work with survey-based qualitative work. We can certainly help you in that area. Dr. Reem is asking, and this is another very interesting question. I finished my master's thesis 2 years ago. Can I publish it now or will it get rejected? I finished my master's thesis before 2 years, I think. So that's a question about having finished the master's thesis very quickly. Well, if the work is good enough for publication, it must be, or you wouldn't have been awarded your master's thesis. I would say most of the requirements at universities for those kinds of professional qualifications, master's theses, PhDs, are the production of publishable work. So very important to have that in mind. If you've been awarded a master's or a PhD by your university, then that, I think, by default means that you've done work that can be published. So by all means, begin the process of writing it up for publication. If you need some help, we can also do that. We can absolutely help you. People are asking for contact information. I'll give you that just now. Let me tell you just a few things very, very quickly about our company, Research Square Company. You can have a look at this link here on the slide. We've been going since 2004, supported more than 3 million authors in 192 countries. We have this preprint server. Do jump on over to the preprint server and have a look at it, because a preprint server, as I mentioned already, is a place where you can upload work that has not yet been submitted to a journal, that's not yet been peer reviewed, put it up there to protect your intellectual property, to protect your information, and to get feedback and comments from the international community. You can rapidly accelerate your impact, you can rapidly accelerate your career, you can rapidly accelerate your route to publication in international journals by considering the use of a preprint server. So I show you this because at Research Square Company, we do have the world's largest preprint server with more than 6 million authors already signed up. Something that I wanted to highlight for you this evening. If you would like to get access to our newest service, digital editing, so AI, artificial intelligence, English editing, high quality technical editing of your work in English in under 10 minutes, then you can have a look at the link in this slide. We'll send everybody the presentation afterwards. You'll be able to sign up for a free account on our site to get your next paper checked for free by our new digital editing service. And we'd appreciate very much your feedback on this service because it's so new. We want to get feedback from researchers on its accuracy, on whether or not you found it helpful. So do go on over to researchsquare.com and have a look at this as well, this new free digital editing service that we've just launched. We do provide, though, other services: English language editing, formatting, figure preparation, translation, grant support, journal selection support. Take a screenshot of this slide. Have a look at this slide when we provide you with a recording. We certainly will. And we provide you with the slides from this presentation. I'm very happy to give everybody listening to this presentation a 10% discount for all of our services. If you'd like to have a look at any of those services, there's my email address and there's my number. You can get in touch with me on WhatsApp. You can get in touch with me on Telegram, or you can just give me a good old-fashioned phone call at the end of our presentation this evening. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand back over to Noram, and we are done with the presentation section of our session together this evening. Thank you so much for joining our webinar, Understanding Research Ethics. My name's Gareth Dyke. My contact details are here in the slide. So thank you all for joining. And Noram, do you want to say something? Do you want to jump back on?
Thank you so much, guys. I enjoyed this speech very much, more than you can even imagine, believe me. By the way, our attendee came from different backgrounds, medical, pharmaceutical. Some of them are decision makers. Some of them are actually taking their very first steps in their own research. So I guess you had covered many details that even experienced researchers are not aware of. So thank you so much. I had really enjoyed it. You are unmuted. Please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can't. Because of your settings, I was unable to unmute myself.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
I muted myself when you were speaking. It's my pleasure to do it, and thank you so much. And we'd like to remind everybody that this is just the first in a series.
Yeah,
we're going to do a whole series of these, right?
Let me show you that we have still a series of webinars. Okay, may I share my screen, please, Gareth?
Absolutely. Hang on a sec.
Okay, take your time.
There we go.
Okay. As we have said, we have a series of webinars for this year offered by Gareth. You will enjoy it so much. Found it. Okay. This is a series of webinars for year 2022 offered by Gareth from Research Square. By the way, I have heard that one of Gareth's webinars had exceeded about 5,000 attendees, right?
Really? Which one was that?
I don't know. I have written it somewhere on the LinkedIn.
That's great. Yeah, cool. Yeah. No, we get sometimes we get sometimes we get decent audiences. It's great. So I hope we hope
Yeah,
to help people.
so
That's the
so
main.
I really really want to thank you so much, Gareth, for your time. Thank you for all attendees from everywhere. Our attendees have came from different backgrounds, different countries, and by the way, maybe most of them have English as their second language. By the way, Gareth's Research Square services are aware and familiar with topics and researchers where English is their second language. Right. I know it. I know it.